Hello everyone, my name is Emily Jacobs and thank you for the opportunity to present my qualitative research exploring the role that emotional awareness plays in the resilience of the ACT Emergency Services personnel. But first, why is this research important? Through my work as a psychologist, I have witnessed firsthand the clinical benefits of cultivating emotional awareness. I often see that individuals who develop their emotional awareness and validate and express their emotions often experience more emotion regulation, better mental health, are more able to implement adaptive coping mechanisms, and subsequently they demonstrate more resilience and can cope more effectively with stress. Overall, this reduces people's vulnerability to experience mental health issues. When considering all of this, I reflected on the implications this may have for people who are faced with significant and chronic stress on a daily basis, where having resilience is absolutely vital. This led me to investigate resilience in the emergency services and what role emotional awareness plays in their ability to be resilient when facing significant stress. Emergency services personnel, including firefighters, police officers, and ambulance personnel, share professional risk factors including exposure to emotional stress and being responsible for community safety. They confront physical and psychological stresses on a daily basis and cope with irregular work hours, an unpredictable volume of incidents, and the expectation to perform flawlessly in emergency situations. Emergency services personnel are at risk of burnout because they regularly face traumatic stresses. Although organisations seek to mitigate the impact of traumatic stresses, maladaptive coping and low resilience are an acknowledged problem in the emergency services. The risk of burnout, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and suicide increases when warning signs of emotional ill health go unnoticed alongside the use of ineffective coping mechanisms. Resilience and emotional awareness are discussed in some of the literature as key targets to prevent and mitigate emotional ill health in emergency services personnel. To clarify, in the literature, resilience is defined as the process of flexible coping and adaptation when facing stress. And emotional awareness is the ability to acknowledge and understand and process emotions. Similar to what I have found in my clinical work, the benefits of emotional awareness include enhanced emotion regulation and expression, more effective interpersonal functioning, and a decreased risk of PTSD. Zier et al. In 2019 suggested emotion regulation and awareness were potential resilience mechanisms. And Birking and colleagues in 2010 found that self-awareness helped officers to accept and tolerate negative emotions, support themselves in distressing situations, and confront emotionally challenging situations. Emergency services personnel would likely benefit from cultivating emotional awareness to promote long-term resilience to stress. However, despite all this research, burnout, mental health issues, and low resilience are still a problem. This highlights a need for a closer look. There appears to be a gap in the literature, whereby research has not explored the rich and meaningful experiences and narratives of emergency services personnel from their perspective. It would be beneficial to explore the differences in the meaning of resilience and emotional awareness from person to person and within each emergency service team to seek some clarity around this. To address this gap, I interviewed 11 emergency services personnel from ACT Fire and Rescue, ACT Ambulance Service, and ACT Policing to explore how they respond to stress and trauma. The study focused on defining resilience and emotional awareness through the lens of those at the front line, and to consider how these concepts related with one another, as well as implications for coping and burnout. So after I obtained informed consent, I commenced the semi-structured interviews in a conversational style to explore their experiences. The 11 interviews ranged in duration from 27 minutes to around 58 minutes. The interviews were then they were audio recorded and then transcribed verbatim and stored confidentially, only accessible to the researchers. We then used thematic analysis to manually derive codes, and when I say codes, I mean meaningful units of text, for example, quotes or statements made by participants, into raw codes, then organize the codes into sub-themes and then into overarching themes. Now, we identified 7 interlinked themes, as you can see here. The first was historical experiences, which involved the sub-themes childhood experiences and emotional expression. The next theme was environment and context, which looked at workplace training, environmental stresses, workplace culture and stigma, and unpredictability and control. The next theme was resilience, with the sub-themes bounce back, just keep going, and managing distressed people. The next theme was coping, where we saw adaptive but also maladaptive coping mechanisms. The next theme was workplace experiences, where we looked at positive experiences in the workplace but also traumatic experiences. And lastly, theme number 7 was burnout, where we saw risks and mitigations of burnout and the term called bucket of bad experiences, which I'll mention later. So, we did find differences in the meaning of resilience described by participants. When I asked the emergency services personnel about resilience, they told me how crucial it was for coping with environmental and workplace stresses, with extreme and unpredictable environments, for mitigating burnout, and for managing other people's distress. Participants told me, and I quote, "Anytime we deal with patients of any kind of trauma, you have to have resilience, otherwise you won't make it emotionally." Now, the emergency services personnel that I interviewed, they were aware of how important resilience was. However, when I asked them to define resilience, their responses suggested that they believed it was a rigid ability to withstand against stress. They told me resilience was the ability to, and I quote, "not get emotional about it, not let good or bad things affect you, and put up a front that cops it for you." This reflected to me that people knew the importance of resilience for healthy coping. However, they defined resilience as remaining unemotional and unaffected by stress, which would likely impact their ability to remain resilient. Now, this is something that training on emotional awareness and resilience would likely help mitigate. Similarly, when I asked participants about emotional awareness, they recognized and emphasized its importance. They explained that it helped them understand their emotions and their emotional reactions. It helped them have empathy and recognize emotions in other people. It improved their communication and prompted help-seeking behaviors. And it guided what coping strategies to implement to mitigate burnout. Now, however, when it came to taking steps to cultivating emotional awareness, there were barriers evident. Although it was clear that most participants were aware of the benefits of emotional awareness, they spoke about barriers that interfered with their ability to cultivate emotional awareness, reflect on their experiences, and maintain resilience. Participants told me about a level of discomfort and vulnerability around acknowledging and expressing their emotions. Some of these barriers included unhelpful cultural and masculinity beliefs, mental health stigma, and a reluctance to seek help. Now, when I asked more about this, participants told me, and I quote, "It's uncomfortable. the stigma that they'll pull you off road or it will go on your record. And another quote, I'm a dude, I'll just deal with it because it's not that bad. And another quote, I just thought it would be a waste of time. Some other participants referred to what they labelled as their bucket of bad experiences. They held the belief that resilience to stress had a limit. Burnout was inevitable, and when it was going to occur depended upon how many negative experiences they had endured. Some other barriers reported by participants included a lack of perceived skills and inadequate training in coping, resilience, and mental health upon entry into the emergency services. Maladaptive coping was also an evident barrier to building resilience and suggested emotional avoidance rather than emotional awareness. One participant told me that after attending a severe motorbike fatality and attempting to perform CPR on the severely deceased injured person, he felt overwhelmed and described it as being very stressful. When I asked how he coped with that experience, he told me, and I quote, I probably managed by not acknowledging it because I don't want to get upset about it. And another quote, I drank about 6 beers really quickly when I got home that night. Another interesting barrier about mental health training reported by a participant, and I quote, some of the mental health training that we do receive is dismissed because the police just see them, the trainers, as civilian people trying to put themselves in the shoes of cops. The whole cop versus civilian mentality. A lot of the older guys have that, which is disappointing. This highlights a barrier to actually receiving and understanding the information that's communicated through training. Now, I, as the lead analyst, really noticed how the participants emphasized help-seeking stigma as the most common maladaptive coping mechanism, as you can see by the graph, followed by avoidance, thinking errors, and then alcohol and drug use. However, there is another meaningful message found in some of the participant narratives. Those participants who spoke about and demonstrated emotional awareness through their reflections and stated engaging in adaptive coping mechanisms, they reflected on resilience as being about adaptive coping and growth. Now, I cannot claim a causal relationship between these constructs. However, this study shows evidence of a rich and meaningful relationship between emotional awareness and resilience, and this has implications for mental health and burnout. As more evidence emerges supporting emotional awareness to promote resilience, the more likely organisations will implement preventative measures to cultivate a more resilient workforce. Through psychoeducation, training programs can correct misperceptions about what it means to be resilient and change stigmatized cultural beliefs about mental health and psychological help seeking. This could reduce the incidence of burnout and benefit the emergency services by generating greater career longevity and protecting the well-being of their personnel. An effective and resilient workforce will accrue significant economic and mental health benefits. This study has communicated an important message and poses a question for the emergency services, but also to be explored in future research. Can emotional awareness be a guide to a less stressful and more resilient career and life? Thank you.